Pittsburgh, May 25, 1935. Forbes Field. Babe Ruth was 40 years old. His legs ached in the specific way that 40-year-old legs ache when they have been asked to do what Ruth's legs had been asked to do for 2 decades. His eyes weren't tracking the ball the way they once had. The swing was still there, still recognizably the swing, still the thing that had produced numbers that the sport had never seen. But the timing was off by fractions that hadn't mattered at 30, and mattered enormously at 40. The press was writing the things that the press writes when a legend is visibly diminishing. Why is he still playing? When will he admit it's over? What does he owe the game, and what does the game owe him? And when does the accounting close? The fans who came to Forbes Field that Saturday afternoon came with the specific emotion that people bring when they know they might be watching a last time. The mixture of hope and sorrow that attends anything that is ending. Ruth walked to the plate for the first time, and nobody expected anything. Then the ball went to the stands. Then he came back. Then it went again. The third time he came to the plate, what happened made everyone in Forbes Field stop breathing for a moment. Because what Ruth did in that third at-bat had never been done in that stadium by anyone, and it would never be done again. To understand what May 25, 1935 meant, you need to understand the season that preceded it. Ruth had spent 1934 as a Yankee, his last season in pinstripes. His numbers were still respectable. 288, 22 home runs. But respectable was not what Ruth had ever been. Respectable was what other players were. Ruth had been historic, had been impossible, had been the thing that made people put down their newspapers and walk to the window because they needed to see whether what they were hearing was actually happening. 288 and 22 home runs in 1934 were the numbers of a very good player. Ruth had never been a very good player. He had been the only player. And the Yankees, with the clinical efficiency of a franchise that had learned to plan for everything including the end of things that seemed like they would never end, made it clear that 1934 was the final year. They offered him a coaching position. He wanted to manage. They said no. The relationship that had defined baseball for 15 years ended with a conversation in an office and a handshake, and Ruth walking out into a New York winter, knowing that the Yankees were behind him. The Boston Braves signed him in February 1935. The arrangement was presented as an opportunity. Ruth would play and also serve as a team vice president and assistant manager. In reality, it was a business decision by the Braves. Ruth's name still drew crowds, even if Ruth's body was no longer fully Ruth. The Braves needed attendance, and Ruth's name meant attendance even at 40 years old. Ruth accepted because he needed to play, not because the money required it. Because stopping was not something he had figured out how to do yet. Because baseball was the only family he had ever really had. Because the alternative to playing was sitting somewhere and watching other men do the thing that had defined him, and that alternative was not something his nature could tolerate. He arrived at spring training and worked, tried. The results were honest. The 40-year-old body was not the same instrument the 30-year-old body had been. The games came and went, and Ruth hit when he could, and missed when the timing wasn't there, and the Braves went about losing in the workmanlike way of a team that has accepted losing as its baseline. And then May 25th arrived. The Pittsburgh Pirates were at home at Forbes Field. A Saturday afternoon. The crowd that came was not enormous. The Braves were not a draw, but Ruth was a draw, and Pittsburgh knew that whatever else was happening in 1935, watching Babe Ruth was still watching something. He arrived at the ballpark the way he always arrived at ballparks, with the specific weight of a man whose body has become famous enough that its presence in a room changes the room. He was heavier than he'd been, moving more slowly. The grace that had always been part of how he inhabited space had not disappeared entirely, but it had been modified by time in ways that were visible to anyone who had watched him in his prime. He went through his pre-game routine. Took batting practice. The swing was still there. Still the swing, just slower to get started. Needing more time to gather what it needed before it arrived at the ball. First at bat, Pirates pitcher Guy Bush on the mound. Bush was a veteran. A serious pitcher who had been in the major leagues since 1923 and who had faced Ruth before and had the specific knowledge of Ruth's tendencies that comes from years of competition. He worked Ruth carefully. Ruth was Ruth even at 40. You didn't give him anything he could turn on without paying the price. The at-bat developed. The count moved. And Ruth found a pitch. The swing happened the way Ruth's swing happened. From the feet up through the hips, through the shoulders, through those wrists that had always been the specific machinery of everything he produced. The ball went deep. The crowd reacted with the noise that the crowd always makes when Ruth hits a baseball a very long way. Home run. 1. Ruth rounded the bases at his pace. Crossed home plate. The crowd gave him what they had. He acknowledged it and returned to the dugout. 1 home run. At 40 years old. In 1935, against a veteran pitcher who had done everything right. 1 home run. Second at-bat. Bush again. The at-bat developed differently. Bush was not going to give Ruth the same pitch twice. Different sequence. Different locations. But Ruth found something again. The swing again. The sound again. The ball going in the direction that the sound indicated it would go. Deep again. Gone again. 2 home runs. 2 at-bats. The crowd was no longer simply watching a legend diminish. They were watching something that they hadn't been prepared for when they woke up that morning. They were watching Babe Ruth hit home runs at Forbes Field in 1935. They were watching the thing that had always been impossible continue to be impossible, even when everything said it should have stopped being possible. Third at-bat. Different pitcher now. Red Lucas. Ruth had faced him. The at-bat was not quick. Lucas worked carefully. Ruth worked back. The count extended. The crowd leaned forward with each pitch in a way they hadn't leaned forward all season, because the first 2 home runs had created something that the third at-bat was now carrying. The possibility. The specific and electric possibility of a third home run, which would be extraordinary by any standard, which would be extraordinary even for the Ruth of 1927, which was almost incomprehensible for the Ruth of 1935. Lucas threw. Ruth swung. And the contact was not like the first 2 contacts. It was deeper, fuller, more complete. The ball left the bat with a sound that was different from the sound the first 2 had made. Different in a way that everyone who heard it registered immediately without being able to articulate why. The ball went up, and up, and up, further, toward right field. Toward the roof of the right field grandstand at Forbes Field. A roof that no baseball had ever cleared. That no player in the history of that stadium had ever reached. The ball hit the roof, cleared it, landed somewhere on the other side in a place that nobody had ever had to think about, because nothing had ever reached it before. Subscribe right now if you've ever watched something end the right way. Hit like if you think Ruth's last game was the most Ruth thing he ever did. And drop a comment below. What was the greatest sports moment you ever witnessed in person? Because what Ruth did rounding the bases the third time tells you everything about who he was. The crowd at Forbes Field was on its feet. Completely. Every person in the stadium standing for a man who was 40 years old and had just done something that had never been done in that stadium by anyone at any age. Ruth rounded the bases. His pace was what his pace always was. Unhurried, deliberate. The trot that had become as recognizable as his face or his swing. But something was different about this particular trip around the bases. Those who were watching closely, the players, the umpires, the reporters in the press box, noticed it. Ruth was moving more slowly than usual. Not from fatigue exactly, from something else. From the quality of attention that a person gives to something they understand. Somewhere in the part of themselves that knows things before the rest of them catches up, they are doing for the last time. He crossed home plate. The crowd gave him everything they had. He looked around the stadium, at the crowd, at the field, at Forbes Field on a Saturday afternoon in May, with the sun coming through the way it comes through in Pittsburgh in the spring. He went back to the dugout. He played 2 more games after May 25th. Did not hit a home run in either. Did not hit much of anything. The body that had produced 3 home runs on Saturday afternoon including one that had gone somewhere no baseball had ever gone at Forbes Field, did not produce the same results on Tuesday and Wednesday. On May 30th, Ruth told the Braves he was done. He was 40 years old and his knees hurt, and the swing that had carried him for 2 decades was no longer reliable enough to perform at the level he required of himself. He retired, officially, with a press statement and a handshake, and the end of something that had begun in 1914 when he was 19 years old and pitching for the Baltimore Orioles. 21 years, 714 home runs, a batting average of .342, a career that had produced records that would stand for decades, and statistics that would take the most advanced analytics a century later to fully appreciate. But the number that Forbes Field carries is not from the record books. It is from the afternoon of May 25, 1935. 3 home runs, and the last one, the one that cleared the roof, that went somewhere no baseball had gone before in that stadium, was hit by a man who was playing the last great game of the last great career in baseball history. Guy Bush, who had given up the first 2 home runs, was asked about it afterward, about what it was like to watch Ruth hit that 3rd one. Bush was a competitor, a proud man who had been in baseball long enough to have his own accomplishments and his own reputation. He said that when the ball cleared the roof, he took his cap off, not in celebration, in acknowledgement, because what Ruth had done that afternoon was something that required acknowledgement regardless of which side of the competition you were on. He said he had never seen anything like it before, that he had been pitching against Ruth for years and had seen Ruth hit balls to places where other people's balls didn't go. But 3 home runs at 40 years old, with the last one clearing a roof that nobody had ever cleared before. He said he took his cap off and he meant it. And Ruth, running the bases for the last time in the last great game of his career, would not have known about Bush's cap, would not have needed to know. The ball had gone over the roof. That was enough. That was always enough. That was Babe Ruth.